resume the recording and make you the host. Okay.
Right. Do. 1 second. All right. Can you all see that?
Yep.
All right. So again, thanks very much for having me. It's an honor. And I'm just going to dive straight in. Forgive me if I'm a little bit slow on the uptake. It's not quite 8 a.m. here on the West Coast. So if there's something that I want you to take away from my talk today, it's this. The social media landscape is complex and often inauthentic, but that doesn't mean that we can or that we should ignore it. And this applies to us both as technical professionals and as members of a democratic society. And also a plug for my startup, Marvelous AI, where we're doing very cool stuff with social media content. A bit of a roadmap for what we'll talk about today. I'll start with some personal background, what got me to where I am today. Then take you on a very brief history of social media analytics before 2015. Talk a little bit about what happened around 2015. And then spend the vast majority of the time talking about the kinds of things we've been doing at Marvelous AI. My own training is as a cognitive linguist. I got my PhD from UC Berkeley. And since then, I've worked at a number of startups and big companies, usually the big companies acquiring the startups. And currently, I am the co-founder and chief scientist of Marvelous AI. Today, I would like to talk about my personal experience analyzing social media data over about the last decade. And I apologize in advance about the amount of political content, but sadly, we can't really get away from it nowadays. And I'll talk for about 35 to 40 minutes and then leave plenty of time for questions. If there are any audio issues in the meantime, please let me know.
Just a quick point. We're seeing your browser right now, rather than
the presentation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was just me.
Mm-hmm. All right, 1 second. Where's my, oh, exciting. I will stop that. We technologists, I think, are the worst at actually using technology. Just like mathematicians can't do simple math. All right.
Use technology so much that we have too many things to open sometimes.
Oh God, don't even get me started on that. How about now?
Yep.
Yeah, good. Big, nice big slide. All right. Still nice big slide. Are you still seeing the nice big slide?
Yep.
All right, great, thank you. Okay. So in the early 2010s, you could say that it was really the heyday of social media analytics. At the time, I was working for a startup called Topsy, where we were doing real-time search over Twitter data. And it seemed like we could do absolutely anything. Using sentiment analysis and geolocation, we could measure public opinion about all sorts of things. For example, we were able to predict the outcome of the 2012 presidential election about as well as Nate Silver at 538. We were able to predict the 2013 Oscar Awards extremely accurately. We were even making inroads in predicting price movements in stocks, as well as things like the spread of hurricanes based on where people were talking about them. But even then, there were some signs of trouble. For one, a full 10% of Twitter conversations were about Justin Bieber. And on a more serious note, for a project on Russian news, I found that about 40% of Russian Twitter was either spam or scam. So the internet was clearly going in some strange direction. In 2013, Topsy was acquired by Apple, and our team stopped working on social media. From a business perspective, that was perhaps for the better. Fast forward to 2015. As we all know now, Russian state-sponsored operatives executed a campaign to influence the outcome of the 2016 US presidential election. This campaign included inauthentic accounts on multiple social media platforms that were trying to stir up existing divisions in order to strengthen Donald Trump's candidacy. This included riling up left-wing supporters of Bernie Sanders during the primaries in order to suppress interest in voting for Hillary Clinton. And later it involved direct attacks on Clinton, directed at the right-leaning audience. And the social media campaign was combined with a hack and leak operation where DNC servers on Hillary Clinton's emails were hacked and the contents released in the most damaging possible way. This also included the creation of many fake news stories, not just by the Russians. As it turns out, on social media, fake news spreads exponentially faster than real news, as you can see in this graph. This is due to a combination of human attraction to clickbait sensationalist content, and also the fundamental assumptions behind the platform's business models. If you have more clicks, then you're gonna have more eyes on advertisements. And so the platforms are incentivized to encourage virality at the expense of almost everything else. Harvard professors Yochai Benkler and Jonathan Ferris published a book in 2018 called Network Propaganda, where they examined in detail what happened in the US media system in 2016. And they found a key asymmetry in the different political parts of the spectrum. It turns out that centrist and center-left media outlets prize factual reporting and get penalized for publishing erroneous or fake content. They get called out by other publications and sometimes their business cannot continue. As a result, a left-wing rumor is unlikely to make it into wide circulation. On the right, however, right-wing media outlets value adherence to political dogma and suffer reputational consequences for straying away from it, much more so than for publishing fake news. And this asymmetry developed over the last few decades. As a result, the right-wing fringe sources can much more easily spread fake news into respected conservative publications like Fox News. As a result of this, Russian operatives were more successful in penetrating the conservative media than they were the liberal media. So let's talk about now. 2016 was certainly a big shock to the system. For me personally, it was a startling realization that social media, linguistic analysis, and Cold War style politics had all come together, combining all of my personal backgrounds as growing up in the Soviet Union, being a linguist, and being a data scientist working on social media. So in the rest of the talk, I will focus on what myself and my colleagues have been doing at Marvelous AI. Just pausing to make sure I'm still displaying the right thing. Oh, good. All right. So Danielle Deibler, Chris Walker, and I founded Marvelous in 2018. And our key mission is to enable truth-committed organizations, social causes, and brands to defend themselves against information operations and to amplify counter-messaging. We approach this problem from our key skill set, which is natural language processing. And right now we are focused on detecting narratives in social media and news. And I'll talk more about what I mean by all of this in a moment. We've been putting all our efforts into our StoryArc media analysis platform. So because so much of our work involves politics, we want to know who is doing the talking on social media. And we are primarily focused on Twitter for this purpose right now. We began with data from an organization called Media Bias Fact Check, who are a group of journalists who rate news websites according to political leaning from left to right and commitment to facts from factual to mixed to mostly non-factual. So in the graph here, we've translated the ratings from Media Bias Fact Check into a two-dimensional scale, and then we use it to infer political leanings and fact commitment of Twitter users based on the kinds of links they share online. So if you mostly share New York Times, you're going to end up in the left upper quadrant, more left of center and more factual. If you share things like InfoWars, you're going to end up in the more right bottom quadrant. We also pull in a bunch of third-party bot identification techniques, as well as some commonly accepted heuristics, like if your account was newly created, or if it has no profile picture, then you get tagged as suspicious. So in this two-dimensional representation, each dot represents a Twitter user. The position of the dot on the graph represents the bias and credibility ratings, and the color represents the extent of bottiness, with gray and black being suspicious or outright bots. Just to give you a quick look at what Twitter looks like, on the left is a random sample of tweets in English from October 2020, not about any particular topic. And the blob on the bottom of the graph are users that we don't know that much about. You can see that most of the users we've been able to tag track towards the left. Twitter tends to skew fairly liberal at the moment, but most people are above the credibility line. There's not a lot of fake news going on. Compare this to Twitter users talking about the presidential election. This is the graph on the right, and you see something very different. Again, there's a big blob of people on the left upper quadrant, but on to the right of center, what you end up seeing is a much messier situation in terms of credibility. And this asymmetry very much is consistent with what Benkler and colleagues have found, and it still holds true. And also, as you can see, there's a really disturbing amount of gray and black dots on the graph, actually on both sides. So what is this data telling us? And is it actually useful for anything? I would argue that yes, it is very much useful for anything. While Twitter can't be used to define public opinion, there are still some things you can get out of it. So at least when it comes to politics, Twitter right now is populated by people who have agendas. And these agendas are multiple. One, Twitter is still a place where elites, like high-placed journalists and public officials, form their opinions. It also serves to set agendas for many journalists. They derive topics from what they see on Twitter. They converse with other journalists, etc. Twitter still serves as a pretty good place for echo chambers and for trolling of your opponents. But importantly for what we're doing, Twitter ends up serving as basically an A/B test platform for messaging for information ops. So by information ops, I mean campaigns that are aimed at changing public discourse about a topic. This could mean convincing people of something that they didn't previously believe, or something that isn't true, or simply sowing uncertainty about what's right and who can be believed. This latter strategy is what the Russians hope to accomplish, and they're still at it, because it clogs up the inner workings of a deliberative democracy. If regular people cannot agree on facts, they have no hope of civilly discussing differences of opinion. Flowing out of this, and important for the work we do at Marvelous, is the emergence and evolution of narratives that can be traced on social media. So what do I mean by narrative? A narrative is a story. This is a very overloaded term. For us, a narrative is a story we tell ourselves and others about who we are in the world, or who others ought to be in the world. Making this notion of narrative operational and computationally tractable is our end goal, and we're making quite some progress towards it. So what makes a narrative a real thing? For one, it has to be visible, which meaning a human looking at a piece of content has to be able to say, yes, this is part of a narrative. It has to be resonant, so multiple people and multiple sources have to agree on it. It has to be telic, which means it has some sort of end goal. In the case of narratives, that's a moral or emotional end goal. You're hoping to induce some kind of emotional state in the people you're talking to. And importantly, a narrative has to be enduring. It isn't limited to just something that happened yesterday, it persists over time. In the case of big national narratives, this could persist over centuries. And here are some examples of narratives, both political and non-political. How do we go about detecting these narratives computationally? We go from two different directions, bottom up and top down. The bottom up method involves discovering themes from our data. So we use various deep learning techniques to cluster pieces of content that are semantically similar into groups. Then we use words that are salient in each group in order to describe it, as you see here. This is part of our coronavirus corpus. Then we can report various aggregate statistics on these clusters, like what is the average political bias and credibility of the users participating in this narrative, as well as what are the emotional scores for this cluster. These clusters serves as an excellent way to identify broad themes, and they can be done with no human participation. They work especially well for topics over short time ranges. But in and of themselves, they do not constitute narratives for a variety of reasons. One of them, that they're not enduring. But they do serve as an excellent way to quickly generate training data for supervised models. In order to detect narratives at the level of resolution that we're interested in, we use supervised models. And the narratives are defined both from the clusters bottom up and from humans based on their understanding of the space and the domain. And having humans in this process is an absolutely critical part of how we approach this. It isn't simply a pathway to full-on AI automation, AI taking over the world. Instead, we see what we do as enabling humans to do their work better. And in the case of narratives, humans are very much involved every step of the way. So I'll spend the rest of the time talking about the kinds of things we've been able to do with this technology. Just pausing for a second in case there's any issues so far. All right, I will move right along. One of our first case studies was looking at female political candidates in the presidential election. So the presidential Democratic field was incredibly diverse this time around on many different levels. Yet somehow we ended up with an older white male candidate. How did this happen? We took a look at the treatment of female candidates specifically, focusing again on Twitter, and our findings were consistent with research showing inherent bias against women in politics. But our study was also the first real quantification of it with this kind of data. And this was work done with Luchina Dimecco, who is a gender researcher. We started by looking at how the official campaign launches were covered on Twitter, focusing on the 6 candidates who were at the top of the polling at the time. And these were Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and Pete Buttigieg. The female candidates are at the top, the males are at the bottom. And this is simply a bias and credibility distribution of conversations around their launch coverage. There is a really, really noticeable difference between male and female candidates in that female candidates have a lot more dots to the right of center and below the credibility line. The amount of this shift also correlates with the candidate standing in the polls. To summarize, here is a chart with the average bias and credibility for each candidate. You can see the women are in red, the men are in blue. The line going from the top left to the bottom right roughly corresponds to increasing popularity in the polls, but with a shift. Basically, there's a penalty for running while female as a Democrat, which translates into more significant attention from the right and less credible fringes. So maybe that's just how it is, and these people running in the Democratic field, so who cares? So we took a look at the top narratives about each candidate and further classified these narratives as being about one of a few different things. A narrative could be about policy, ideology, the candidate's character as a person, their identity, or their electability, because this was the primary election. What we found was that female candidates were attacked or sometimes praised, mostly based on their character or their identity. Like Kamala Harris is not authentically American, authentically progressive, or authentically Black. Or Elizabeth Warren lied about her ethnic heritage. By contrast, the male candidates, even when they were being attacked, were mostly attacked based on their electability. Sometimes people even talked about policy differences. We believe that these narratives helped ensure that the female candidates didn't come anywhere close to the top in any of the actual voting. And in the case of Harris, didn't even make it to the first Iowa caucuses. For any of you political junkies in the audience, both this election and the 2016 election really demonstrated that the narrative landscape is largely set during the primaries. Politicians often prefer to focus their energies on the general campaign, but they do so at their own peril because a lot of the malicious narratives have already set in by then.
Oh yeah, can I ask a question?
Yep.
I remember reading some things about Kamala Harris. I don't know if it was during the campaign or during the primary, but a lot of it was like talking about how she dressed, and I thought, wow, I was like, who cares?
Very much so, and the same was true of Hillary Clinton in 2016. So this is researchers have noticed this for a long time. And for a while, it seemed like journalists were doing better this time around, but at the end of the day, not really. All right, so enough of that. We've been working with Professor Sarah Oates at University of Maryland. Professor Oates studies Russian propaganda. After what happened in 2016, she was interested in finding evidence that perhaps Russia was trying to influence the US political discourse, maybe by starting narratives advantageous to Russia on their state-sponsored outlets like Russia Today or Sputnik, and then having them spread into the US mainstream publications. We were hoping that we'd be able to detect computational signatures of a Russian narrative first starting in RT and then spreading. What we found instead was that Russia was simply able to take advantage of existing cleavages. And all we really had to do was ape US right-leaning outlets. So this chart is a look at the top narratives about Joe Biden around the end of summer, sorted by the proportion of content dedicated to Biden's supposed corruption. The outlet most focused on this was right-wing Twitter, followed by Russian state-sponsored outlets, followed by Fox News. And it turned out that you really couldn't tell apart RT from Fox. They were using the same narratives, the same kinds of language. We really created this perfect opportunity for the Russians to amplify our own ways of tearing each other apart. So somewhat disheartened by this, we thought, let's try to find something that maybe isn't so divisive. So we decided to look at coronavirus. And by the way, we've been collecting social media mentions of coronavirus going back to March, and it is a public data set that we are happy to share and happy to collaborate on. Less happily, what we found was the same sort of polarization in people talking about coronavirus. So this word cloud is a representation of the most salient words by the left-leaning Twitter users versus the right-leaning Twitter users talking about coronavirus. The left-leaning ones are in blue, the right-leaning ones are in red. And I will attempt to switch to an animation. Can everyone see that? So this is the same salient words on the left and the right over time. And you can see that even going back as early as March, on the left, it was most about spikes in cases and also mismanagement by political officials. On the right, it was very quickly focused on basically QAnon and related hashtags, as well as various conspiracy theories like Bill Gates in combination with George Soros and China all unleashed the virus on the US in order to inject people with vaccines. There was very little talk about actual solutions in any of this. So sadly, back to politics. In the wake of the November election, a right-wing narrative arose around the election being fraudulently administered. This narrative coalesced around the hashtag Stop the Steal. On the left, there was a parallel narrative about voter suppression efforts, although this one was active somewhat before the election. So we thought to compare the kinds of accounts that participated in both of these narratives on the left and the right. And noticed that on the right, there was a lot more bot activity pushing this narrative. So on the one hand, that's sort of encouraging that it was mostly bot activity that pushed this conspiracy theory. But as we all learned last week, this online bot activity still produced a real life mob of real people engaging in real violence. And that's really quite shocking. So to end on a more positive note, I'd like to show you an example where an information operation did not succeed. And this is the case of Hunter Biden and his laptop. So Hunter Biden is Joe Biden's son, who has had a somewhat checkered past. On October 14th, the New York Post published a story purporting that Hunter Biden's laptop contained evidence of his corruption, specifically of trying to sell access to his father. This was a very poorly disguised forge and hack and leak operation. And even the author of the original story later regretted writing it and not checking his sources. Nevertheless, right-wing influencers in various media outlets attempted to amplify this story, but it didn't get a whole lot of pickup in the mainstream media. On Twitter, the story made significant inroads among the right-leaning crowd, but not among the left. So on this chart, you see the percentage of election-related talk that was focused on Hunter Biden starting in early October. The right-leaning talk was, which is in red, was much more heavily dominated by Hunter Biden than the left. This lack of pickup by left-leaning or mainstream media is in stark contrast to how the media treated the Clinton hacked emails in 2016. And in a way demonstrated that journalists now are much more prepared to check their sources and to expect info ops in times of elections. In fact, many platforms censored or refused to allow people to share this fake news story. This is a tweet, an old tweet from Trump complaining that the story wasn't getting its due attention. I cannot render it as an actual tweet because Trump is no longer allowed on Twitter. And also our system correctly identified this tweet as talking about Biden being corrupt. So in a way, society was more prepared for this. There may have been another factor at play as well. Looking at the distribution of account types in the political conversation on Twitter, we noticed that in the week around October 9th, there was a sudden drop in content from suspicious and known bot accounts. And this is data coming from Twitter search APIs. Looking at the accounts, at the bot accounts that were previously active in this collection, we noticed that they were still very much active and still very much tweeting at the rate that didn't seem any different. So we were wondering what's going on. We also get data from Twitter streaming API, which doesn't do any sort of ranking and is a flat sample of tweets. And in a collection of tweets matching the same keywords from the streaming API, there was no difference in accounts distribution. So it's possible that Twitter took steps to lessen the influence of such accounts. They didn't ban them outright, but perhaps they changed their ranking. And as it turns out, they did this just in time. So what now? What's next for us as a company and perhaps for us as a society? First, a look at a broader sense of what our StoryArc platform is able to do. In addition to narrative detection, we also do fine-grained emotion detection, things like anger and fear and disgust and joy and trust, which we find to be much more useful than positive and negative sentiment analysis. We are able to do analytics on multiple different types, such as news, TV transcripts, even song lyrics. We have pretty good integration for folks to bring their own data in various like CSV formats. And we have built a nice collection of workflows for including humans in the loop for all of this. We also have a number of public data sets that we are open to collaborating on. And we're building out multilingual features. Looking beyond Twitter, of course, we realize that focusing on Twitter is a bit of a blind spot, especially when it comes to information operations. It's been shown that information moves across this media ecosystem, flipping between perhaps fringe news outlets, state-sponsored outlets, various social media sites, and more mainstream news sites. Being able to detect what kinds of stories will jump the gap into mainstream ought to allow responders to prioritize these efforts. Some fringe news stories will never make it into the mainstream, and you shouldn't have to worry about them. In fact, you may really want to avoid mentioning them because otherwise you may give them more attention than they deserve. Other news stories are likely to jump the gap, and you need to really prioritize how you respond to them. We are also working on tying these fairly short-term political narratives into long-established societal zeitgeist, if you will, and figuring out how to do that in a computationally feasible way. We also realized that information travels visually as well as linguistically. And so to the extent that we can add image analysis to our suite, we would be excited. Looking ahead more broadly, I think that this agenda-driven public discourse will continue to be the norm. We're not going back to the days where people naively share their opinions in public forums without any sort of agenda. And disinformation will continue to be a tool that's used to reinforce desired narratives, especially as they align with people's pre-existing biases. In the short term, these tactics are very likely to become more common in the commercial space. You can easily imagine a foreign actor or a competitor starting malicious rumors about a brand, like a vaccine manufacturer. If that brand doesn't understand its threat surface and doesn't treat it like a cybersecurity risk, the damage can be irreversible. You can think of this as cognitive security akin to cybersecurity. In the longer term, we want to be part of an ecosystem creating resilience against questionable information and radicalization, and to move beyond simply tracking and reacting after the malicious narratives have entered the system. Think of it as creating informational probiotics. And we are very much open for collaboration on any of this. So thank you to my co-founders and the rest of the marvelous team, as well as all the people we've collaborated with. I will end here and stop sharing and leave time for questions.
Looks like we have a question from Dana. Dana, you're about to jump off, but I think a couple of similar questions pertaining perhaps to, without going into your secret sauce, maybe just touching up, on what's, underneath the hood in terms of how you are able to detect authentic versus inauthentic activity. Are you processing?
Yeah, sure. So for authentic versus inauthentic, we try to stay away from making those decisions ourselves. Okay. That's a somewhat fraught area. So we pull in, there's a number of services like Bot Sentinel, Hamilton 68, The Guardian, that identify inauthentic accounts. So we pull those in. There are also some fairly well-known heuristics, like if you have an account that was created in the last year, that has no profile picture, if you have 40,000 followers and you follow 40,000 people, if your account is a string of letters and numbers. So there are things like this that are suggestive of inauthentic activity. we're more interested in aggregate, sort of knowing how much of the traffic is coming from these suspicious accounts than we are at pointing fingers like, hey, you were a bot. We don't really want to be in that business.
Anybody else want to unmute? And I don't see anything else in the chat.
This is Lori Radizak. I had to leave in the middle for another meeting. So I'm looking forward to watching the recording, but I was just wondering whether Olya touched on, how do you know when you need to bring in a specialist like her and her group, and when you can do it on your own?
That's a good question. I think most smaller organizations don't have the capacity. It's sort of a sweet spot. If you're a local city council person, then the amount of social media traffic directed at you is going to be small enough for your staff to just go through it. If you are a president, then you might have a whole team dedicated to tracking misinformation about you. But there's sort of a sweet spot of organizations that are big enough to have enough volume and enough of a threat surface, but not tech savvy enough to be able to do anything about it themselves.
I have a question: how the shutdown of certain accounts has affected your work? And
we sort of take it as it comes. Sometimes we discover that accounts that disappear from our search results are still there, for example, or it's a really interesting way to track how the narratives are changing. So one of the, I was talking about how a lot of the bot activity disappeared in the beginning of October. At first, I thought that this meant that a lot of the right-wing figures went somewhere else, like Parler, and was wondering what that would do to the remaining people and the narratives that they were trying to push. And it turned out that the remaining narratives weren't actually all that different. There was just less volume. So there was still a combination of trying to own the libs and trying to promote Trump's agenda. Although I do wonder what's going to happen to Twitter now that there's going to be a new administration that's not as Twitter focused.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's really interesting. You know, like you said, it's a bit of a, focusing on just one platform can have its blind spots, and it is a pretty unique platform in terms of, in the last presentation, we were talking about the different user bases of the different platforms and their age ranges, and then even what people are likely to have social media accounts to begin with, but even those that do, how they stratify. And so you're starting out on a platform that has some selection bias in terms of who is on it, who is authentic, and then you're throwing in into the mix people with either bots or the other question I had is I know people maintain a number of personal Twitter does allow you, unlike Facebook, to create a bunch of accounts that you could manually go and use those, and so it just always seems to me like it could be, even without the bots, it could be just such a skewed sample of
absolutely. Yeah, so there's a couple things. One is focusing on Twitter is a little bit like looking for your keys under the lamppost instead of where you actually lost them, because it's open. The APIs are great. It's available for collection, unlike, say, Facebook or WhatsApp. On the other hand, I think as long as you realize what you're after, as long as you're trying to study the formation of opinions or the formation of narratives and agenda setting, then Twitter is a great place. I would absolutely not go there for any approximation of polling or regular people's actual beliefs.
And there was, I was going to ask if there was any.
The human, yep.
Yeah.
Well, so I think our fundamental approach to this is that humans know way more about narratives than anyone else. Even humans that are perhaps not experts, not political scientists, and marrying their knowledge with what machines can do is really the only way forward. There's this hype now around the giant deep learning models like GPT-3, supposedly being intelligent and being able to do all sorts of things. But once you dig in, they're actually not all that intelligent, as it turns out. And for me as a linguist, that was sort of satisfying and a bit of schadenfreude to see the failings of these models, because human knowledge really is key. So for us, we want to make, first of all, we want to make maximum progress in identifying narratives. Second, we're doing it for people. So we want to enable those people to work faster, more efficiently. And that's why we include them every step of the way.
Hi, this is Rich Brooks. I was the one who asked the question about including human expertise with supervised models. Would you say that, I guess, as a positive for humans, we still have a little bit better capability to be critical and to think critically about the information than, say, artificial intelligence does, at least for now?
Absolutely. I think that will always be true. Humans are the only ones who can formulate the questions and set the parameters of a problem. I view AI as really sophisticated statistics, but it has its limits, and in any sort of training can only, it all comes down to what kind of data you give it. Also, of course, there's big controversies around biases in training data for these machines. And while scientists are working out ways to mitigate that, I think having humans set the ethical goals for what they're hoping to do is crucial.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we've touched on in the previous meeting, but yeah, like around credit decisions, or you're training it on data from previous high or low credit risks, but inherent in that are other demographic characteristics that might not be causational, but now they've made their way into the model.
Yep, or even worse, sentencing guidelines. Or bail decisions are notoriously prone to this kind of prior bias.
Yeah, my curiosity was, if you had plans to apply this technology to more of the neighborhood politics in terms of, I asked that because of who I see on Twitter a lot, and it's pretty well represented in both in both camps. But yeah, like around the issues of urbanism and YIMBY and versus affordable housing policies, and there is different, and they are persistent somewhat. I think those.
Yep. I think for us it's a matter of having the right sort of client or partner, but we would absolutely be delighted to work on that.
All right. I don't think I see any other questions. So
Great.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Yep. And if anyone wants to reach out afterwards, I'll put my email into the chat.
Oh yeah, I gotta ask. Is your last, how do you say your last name?
Well, do you want to, if you want to say it the correct Russian way, it's Gurevich.
Are you related to the G in MiG?
No. It's actually a fairly common Russian Jewish last name. That's also the same as Horowitz.
Oh, okay. Okay. I was curious because I saw it and I was, wait a second. I was like, I've seen that name before.
Although
and then I went and looked it up.
there's a prominent computational linguist named Irina Gurevich, who lives in Germany, who is his niece, I think. And
Oh, okay. I thought that'd have been pretty cool.
Yeah, I would have. Sadly, no.
Yeah, it's and so just a bit of curiosity. We are from, I believe, the same hometown, actually.
Yep, we were born in the same town in Russia.
And and so I can tell you this is not revealing any PII on my part, because it's not her maiden name. It actually is. She never changed it. My mother's name is Markova, and my uncle had a company. Still has, and so Markov Processes is so there is another famous person, but with Markov that he always gets confused for, and no relation there either.
I am, however, distantly related to Garry Kasparov.
Oh, really?
That's my claim to fame. Yes.
Yeah.
Some sort of cousin many times removed.
Huh.
All right.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, we'll post this when we can, hopefully next week. And what I'll do is I'll send a link with email when it's ready, so that everybody can catch portions that they missed or share it with others. Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks again.
Oh yeah, thank you. This was great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Now you're as the host, when you close it out, I think it will.
Oh, I know. I will do the nicer thing. I will just leave.
Well, you can hand back to me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Oops.
Either way. All right. I'll now end the meeting. Thank you all.